Wilhelm Reich 1 by Maurice Brinton. This pamphlet consists of a translation of Reich's famous essay, What is Class Consciousness?, first published in 1934 under the pseudonym of Ernst Perel. It includes an introduction, some well-chosen illustrations, an excerpt from the preface to the third, 1945 edition of Reich's Mass Psychology of Fascism, and the full text of the Sex Pole Manifesto of 1936. The subject is topical in view of the resurgence of interest in Reich's writings and of the new awareness, at least among some revolutionaries, of the many factors influencing class consciousness, delaying its appearance or distorting its features. The essay is essential reading for anyone interested in looking a little deeper than the surface of things or dissatisfied with the facile political, quote, explanations, end quote, which are the stock in trade of so many on the left. Unfortunately, Reich's text, while containing many insights of deep significance, is vitiated by a number of Leninist residues. Throughout, Reich endorses the belief that the, quote, leadership must bring revolutionary consciousness to the masses, end quote. Reich claims that, quote, awareness of the social situation, of the means of the social situation's mastery, and of the correct path to socialism must be concentrated in the revolutionary vanguard, end quote. Party members are described as the, quote, engineers, bricklayers, and carpenters, end quote, of the building of socialism. Lenin is described as, quote, the greatest mass psychologist of all time, end quote. All this, moreover, is not merely a verbal tribute. It permeates much of the practical approach. It is always the party which is failing to understand the real nature of class consciousness, failing to stress this or that in the party's propaganda, and thereby failing to evoke the appropriate echoes. It would be a tragedy, however, if modern revolutionaries saw no further than these hang-ups, and in their revulsion failed to get to grips with Reich's main message, namely that, quote, one of the reasons for the failure of the revolutionary movement is that the real life of individuals played out on a different level than the instigators of social revolution believe, end quote. End quote. Quote, while we were presenting the masses with grandiose historical analyses and economic arguments about the contradictions of imperialism, their innermost feelings were being kindled for Hitler, end quote. Still shocked at the, quote, total failure, end quote, of the German left in the early 1930s, quote, to seize the imagination and enthusiasm of the masses, end quote, Reich is making a plea for a revolutionary political psychology. This is a useful approach provided it is seen as a means of gaining a new awareness in the springs of human behavior, rather than as a means of developing a new manipulative technique. Despite its title, Reich's essay is not really about the nature of class consciousness. It is about all that prevents the growth of such consciousness. Although constantly stressing the need for revolutionary leadership, Reich is realist enough to perceive that even the best of leadership cannot create class consciousness. It cannot even contribute to the growth of such consciousness if it were not, quote, inherent in the daily experience of the working class, end quote. The main problem for Reich is to seek what it is, in society at large and in the practice of revolutionaries in particular, which inhibits the growth of that consciousness. Quote, if you want to develop class consciousness, end quote, Reich writes, quote, you must at least know what you want to develop, why it does not spontaneously develop under the pressure of deprivations of every sort, and hence what stops it doing so, end quote. Queries of this type, Reich reminds us, would always cause intense annoyance among party functionaries or activists of all kinds, a clear identification that the left were not even aware of the impotence of these questions, let alone capable of providing an answer. In this respect, the, quote, scene, end quote, doesn't seem to have changed much. Reich starts by contrasting the, quote, consciousness, end quote, of the leaders and the consciousness of the masses. The leaders know, quote, about the contradictions of the capitalist economic system, the terrific possibilities of socialist planning, the necessity of social revolution in order to accommodate the form of appropriation to the form of production, end quote. They know all about the, quote, progressive and reactionary forces in history, end quote. The consciousness of the masses, quote, is remote from such knowledge and from wide perspective. It is concerned with petty, banal, everyday questions, end quote. The leaders, quote, grasp the objective socioeconomic process whose external conditions of an economic and social nature to which the individuals constituting society are subjected, end quote. The masses, on the other hand, are, quote, completely unconcerned by the quarrels of Russia and Japan or England and America or in the development of the productive forces, end quote. Mass consciousness is, quote, made up of concern about food, clothing, family relationships, the possibilities of sexual satisfaction in the narrowest sense, sexual pleasure and amusements in a broader sense, such as the cinema, theater, fairground entertainments, and dancing, end quote. It is concerned, quote, with the difficulties of bringing up children, with furnishing the house, with the length and utilization of free time, etc. If politics are to bring about international socialism, they, quote, must find the connection with the petty, banal, primitive, simple, everyday life and wishes of the broadest mass of the people in all the specificity of their situation in society, end quote. Reich then turns to the, quote, traditional allegiances, end quote, and to the, quote, wishes, anxieties, ideas, and thoughts, end quote, which inhibit the development of class consciousness. He points out that, quote, political reaction with fascism and the church at its head demands of the working classes the renunciation of earthly happiness, obedience, propriety, abjuration, and self-sacrifice, end quote. Reaction, quote, grows politically fat from the fulfillment of these demands by the masses themselves, end quote. Reaction bases itself, quote, on the guilt feelings of every member of the proletariat, upon their usual unassuming moderation, upon their tendency to undergo privation with dumb willingness and sometimes even with joy, end quote. Reaction and the church exploit the identification of the masses with the glorious Führer, whose, quote, love for the nation, end quote, is substituted for real satisfaction of popular needs. Reich then comes to the kernel of his analysis. Revolutionaries must recognize that, quote, the principle of renunciation is harmful, stupid, and reactionary, end quote. Quote, the principle of full earthly pleasure, by which Reich does not mean, quote, beer and skittles, end quote, must be set against the political reactionaries' principle of renunciation. Quote, end quote. Quote, the moderation of the, quote, simple man, end quote, the prime virtue as far as church and fascism are concerned, is from the standpoint of socialism his greatest fault, one of the many elements which militate against his class consciousness, end quote. Quote, we are heading up a dead end, end quote, Reich writes, quote, if we consider class consciousness an ethical quality, end quote, and hence compete with the bourgeoisie and its agents on grounds of their choosing, it would not only be futile but harmful to condemn, for instance, quote, adolescent sexuality, the character of prostitutes, the depravity of the criminal and immorality of the thief, end quote. Reich clearly differentiates this attitude from any, quote, romantic admiration for the world of crime, end quote. He points out that, quote, everything which goes by the name of morality and ethics today stands unequivocally in the service of the oppression of working humanity, end quote. Quote, everything that supports and strengthens the bourgeois order and attaches people to it, is an impediment to class consciousness, end quote. On the other hand, quote, everything that is in contradiction with the bourgeois order that contains the seeds of revolt may be regarded as an element of class consciousness, end quote. Reich warns that the right will exploit these, quote, amoral, end quote, conceptions in its propaganda. This doesn't matter, Reich says, for the right has anyway always considered the left as thieves who want to expropriate the means of production. Failure to deal with these matters, or, quote, holier than thou, end quote, attitudes on the part of the left will only drive the frustrated and misunderstood masses into the arms of reaction. We have touched on this subject in previous issues of Solidarity, perhaps without appreciating its full significance. In industrial struggles, for instance, there is always nearly always a very strong urge among workers to, quote, make the dispute official, end quote, to project an image of being moderate, sensible people acting constitutionally and within the framework of a procedure, quote, agreed, end quote, by both sides. Instead of defending a sack steward or being a good militant, doing things that the trade union bureaucracy will not and cannot do, he is defended as, quote, only implementing official union policy, end quote, etc. From where do these conformist attitudes stem? Dealing with inhibiting influences, Reich stresses the importance of the early rebellion against the parents. Quote, sexual inhibition, the fear of sexual activity, and the corresponding feelings of guilt, are always either reactionary or at least inhibit revolutionary thinking. Sexual oppression is so immediately perceptible for the child, and class problems for the most part so alien to its thinking, that there is no question of choice in the matter. Early, correct sexual knowledge does not merely create a lively attachment to the person giving it, does not merely destroy all the child's usual mistrust of adults, but constitutes in itself the best foundation for irreligious thinking and hence of class feeling, end quote. The ideological struggle against, quote, being good, end quote, is seen by Reich as, quote, one of the most important tasks on the ideological front, end quote. Attachment to the parents, on the other hand, is, quote, a powerful inhibiting element which can never be exploited by revolutionaries in the interests of social revolution, end quote. Reich points out that these are class questions, not personal matters. The church was well aware of this, even if the revolutionaries, permeated by bourgeois inhibitions, were not. The church was not afraid to discuss, quote, these so-called taboo subjects. As far as it was concerned, children masturbating was a political matter, end quote. It required care and sensitivity to discuss these subjects with children. Quote, revolutionaries should at least not get in the way by chiming in with the church, end quote. Reich then discusses such things as, quote, parades, uniforms, and military music, end quote, all seen as factors damaging the development of critical consciousness. The right would always be better than the left at the game of pageantry at creating myths and immobilizing people around them. The task of the left was to blend natural emotion with real understanding. This required patience and some insight into what went on in people's minds. It required understanding their unarticulated fears and doubts, the pressure to which they were submitted in the home or more generally outside the work situation. Quote, a worker can never be brought to class feeling by simply being called on to strike, as those obtuse individuals demand who do not know what goes on in a worker's mind, end quote. The message here is as relevant today as when first uttered nearly 40 years ago. Honest discussions about all aspects of life will, on the other hand, gain workers to the revolutionary cause, quote, if not immediately for a strike, certainly for later, when such islands of comprehension of the psychology of the masses come together in suburbs, towns, and provinces, and the feeling that there are people who know exactly what is preoccupying one, arousing one's indignation, holding one back, driving one on, at the same time restricting one, begins to gather people like an avalanche, end quote. In a passage of adept relevance to what might happen tomorrow, Reich writes that, quote, that in the course of the last 10 years, adolescents, adults, men and women, people from every walk of life, have passed through the revolutionary organizations without becoming attached or committed to the revolutionary cause, end quote. What drove them in the first place? Quote, not uniforms, not material advantage, merely vague socialist conviction, revolutionary feeling, end quote. And why did they not stay in? Quote, because the organization failed to develop the revolutionary feeling, end quote. Why did people lapse into indifference or go to the right? Quote, because there were bourgeois structures in them that were not destroyed, end quote. Why were they not destroyed? Quote, because nobody knew what to promote and what to destroy, end quote. The desired objective could not be achieved by appeals to discipline, not even, quote, by music and marching for the others. The right could do that a lot better, end quote. The desired objective could not be achieved by appeals to discipline, not even, quote, by music and marching for the others. The right could do that a lot better, end quote. Nor could it be done with slogans, quote, for the political clamor of the others was better and more powerful, end quote. Quote, the only thing which the revolutionary organization could, without competition, have offered the masses, and which in reality they did not offer, would have been the knowledge of what the uneducated oppressed children of capitalism, hankering both after freedom and after authoritarian protection, really wanted, without themselves being clearly aware of it, end quote. The revolutionaries should have put all this into words and said it for the masses in their own language. Quote, but organizations which dismissed all psychology as counter-revolutionary were not up to such tasks, end quote. Underlying these formulations of Reich's are a number of very important matters: the role of intellectuals in the revolutionary movement, the importance of knowledge as a basis of self-activity, the growth of, quote, consciousness, end quote, etc., which we cannot here go into. Among other interesting insights of Reich's, one might mention his observations that organizations which saw themselves, quote, the preordained leaders of the coming revolution repelled people and will be swamped in the revolution itself. Reich also repeatedly stressed that revolutionary propaganda should be positive. It should not be frightened of discussing the future as concretely as possible. Fear of revolution was partly the product of ignorance. The broad, quote, apolitical, end quote, masses would have a decisive effect upon the fate of the revolution. Revolutionaries should therefore find them where they are. Revolutionaries should, quote, politicize private life, fairs, dance halls, cinemas, markets, bedrooms, hostels, and betting shops, end quote. Long before the Situationists or Solidarity came on the scene, Reich had proclaimed that, quote, revolutionary energy lies in everyday life, end quote. This synopsis can only give a partial insight into the sort of problems Reich is dealing with. It should be enough, however, to cause serious revolutionaries to ask themselves a few questions about what they are really doing, about the emphases and priorities of their work, about the, quote, triumphalist, end quote, myths some are so busy concocting, and about the lasting content of their, quote, interventions, end quote. Solidarity 7, I guess issue 2, June 1972. I'm just going to read the next section and just record this all as one video, but the next chapter, or the next essay, is called Wilhelm Reich 2, which was published in issue 3 of Solidarity Volume 4. Socialist reproduction are to be congratulated for popularizing this little-known text of Wilhelm Reich's, which appeared simultaneously in 1929 in Unter dem Banner des Marxismus, the theoretical journal of the German Communist Party, and its Russian equivalent, Pod Znamenaim Marxisma. It is a symptom of the void in both psychoanalytic and meaningful radical literature today that we have to thread our way back for more than 4 decades to find a sensible discussion of these interesting matters. Unlike previous texts of Reich's, to which we have referred in either the review of What is Class Consciousness or the pamphlet The Irrational in Politics, quote, dialectical materialism and psychoanalysis, end quote, is of no immediate relevance to an understanding of human needs or the founts of human action. It is something very different, an attempt by Reich to reply to some of his critics in both the psychoanalytic and Marxist movements. It is important to situate the text in the Germany of the late 20s. In 1929, Reich's break with Freud was on the horizon. Its roots clearly understood. Personal relations with Freud, however, were not as yet embittered. The break with the Stalinists was also in the offing. Relations were bitter, but had not as yet been traced back to their ideological source. In 1929, Reich is walking 2 tightropes. He uses Freud to argue against Freud and the Freudians, and Marx to argue against the Marxists. It is a difficult endeavor, as we have learned from our own experience. Reich starts by pointing out, rightly in my opinion, that most of those on the left who were criticizing Freudian psychoanalysis or Marxism were doing so on the basis of an inadequate knowledge of either or both. He sought to define the proper object of psychoanalysis as, quote, the study of the psychological life of man in society, end quote, a, quote, auxiliary to sociology, end quote, a form of social psychology, end quote. He defined limits for the discipline. He freely admits that the Marxists are right when they reproach certain representatives of the psychoanalytic school with attempting to explain what cannot be explained by that method. But he points out, quote, they are wrong when they identify the method with those who apply it and blame the method for their mistakes, end quote. Both psychoanalysis and Marxism are seen by Reich as, quote, science, end quote, psychoanalysis of the science of psychological phenomenon and Marxism of social phenomenon, and by implication, unarguably valid. That the categories and values of science might themselves be products of historical evolution is barely envisaged. In this whole approach, Reich is echoing the, quote, scientific, end quote, ethos of the epoch, which had its roots in the rise of the bourgeoisie and its drive to control and dominate nature, rather than to live in harmony with it. Reich vigorously defends psychoanalysis against the charge of being idealist. To the indictment that it arose, quote, during the decades of the decaying bourgeoisie, end quote, he retorts that Marxism did too. Quote, so what, end quote, he rightly asks. He dismisses those who crudely attack all knowledge as, quote, bourgeois thought knowledge. He dismisses those who crudely attack all knowledge as, quote, bourgeois knowledge, end quote. Quote, a culture, end quote, he points out, quote, is not uniform like a bushel of peas. The beginnings of a new social order germinate in the womb of the old. By no means everything that has been created by bourgeois hands in the bourgeois period is of inferior value and useless to the society of the future, end quote. Reich attacks the simplistic mechanical materialism of those who had claimed that psychological phenomenon as such do not exist, that, quote, only objective facts which can be measured and weighed are true, not the subjective ones, end quote. Reich sees this as an understandable but nevertheless misguided reaction against the Platonic idealism still dominating bourgeois philosophy. Reich demolishes Vogt's once popular thesis that, quote, thought is a secret. Reich demolishes Vogt's once popular thesis that, quote, thought is a secretion of the brain in the same way that urine is the secretion of the kidney, end quote. To dispose of this nonsense, Reich calls Marx to his rescue, and the Marx of the Theses on Feuerbach, the Marx who wrote that it was not good enough to say that, quote, changed men were the products of changed upbringing, end quote, because this forgot, quote, that it is men that change circumstances, end quote. Psychological activity, Reich correctly insists, has a material reality and is a force in history that only the most short-sighted would deny. There is no reason, Reich argues, why psychoanalysis should not have a materialist basis. He boldly plunges the Freudian categories and concepts into the reality of the class society around them. Quote, the reality principle as it exists today, end quote, he writes, is, quote, a principle of our society, end quote. Adaptation to this reality is a conservative demand. Quote, the reality principle of the capitalist era imposes upon the proletarian a maximum limitation of his needs, while appealing to religious values such as modesty and humility. The ruling class has a reality principle which serves the perpetuation of its power. If the proletariat is brought up to accept this reality principle, if it is presented to him as absolutely valid, e.g. in the name of culture, this means an affirmation of the proletarian's exploitation and of capitalist society as a whole, end quote. Reich submits other Freudian categories to the same kind of historical and sociological critique while seeking to retain the Freudian category's essence. The, quote, unconscious, end quote, too, Reich points out, may acquire new symbols in an era of technological change. Zeppelins in dreams could assume the same sexual significance as snakes. Let me get a drink. Having argued more or less convincingly that there can be, and in fact there is, a materialist basis to psychoanalysis, and that the subject requires no roots in metaphysical morality, Reich goes on to try and show that psychoanalysis is also dialectical. And here he comes unstuck. Like Lysenko and his genetics, Reich has to, quote, tidy up, end quote, the rich reality of his insights, not to mention Freud's, to make them fit into a ludicrous mold of, quote, unity of opposites, end quote. Quote, transformation of quantity into quality, end quote, and, quote, negations of the negation, end quote, all drawn straight from the simplistic pages of old Pop Engel's Dialectics of Nature. Paul Maddock laid this particular ghost a number of years ago, and it is sad to see socialist reproduction resurrected without comment. Those pages are certainly the Achilles heel of the whole essay, for all his protestations that psychoanalysis is an empirically verifiable set of propositions. Reich shows that he is nevertheless caught in a methodological trap of his own making, and that he is not really an unhappy prisoner. Someday someone should write about the anal eroticism of the system makers, from Marx and Darwin via Trotsky to Reich. Why did they all suffer badly from piles? Reich finally discusses the sociological position of psychoanalysis. He is here on firmer soil. Like Marxism, psychoanalysis is a product of the capitalist era. It is a reaction to the era's ideological superstructure, the cultural and moral conditions of modern man in society. Reich brilliantly analyzes the ambivalent relations to sexuality and of the nascent bourgeoisie and the role of the church during the bourgeois revolutions. The bourgeoisie now had to barricade itself against, quote, the people, end quote, by moral laws of its own. Double standards of sexual morality emerged, well analyzed in other of Reich's writings. Quote, just as Marxism, end quote, Reich concludes, quote, was sociologically the expression of man becoming conscious of the laws of economics and of the exploitation of a majority by the minority, a majority by a minority, so psychoanalysis is the expression of man becoming conscious of the social repression of sex, end quote. In lines of great lucidity, but already seated with the bitterness that was later to consume him, Reich even foresees the frenetic commercial exploitation of a debased psychoanalysis. Capitalism rots everything. Quote, the capitalist mode of existence was strangling psychoanalysis, both from the outside and inside, end quote. Quote, in bourgeois society, psychoanalysis was condemned to sterility. In bourgeois society, psychoanalysis was condemned to sterility, if to nothing worse, as an auxiliary science to the science of education in general, end quote. Psychoanalytic education would only come to fruition with the social revolution. Psychoanalytic educators who believed otherwise were living in a fool's paradise. Quote, society is stronger than the endeavors of its individual members, end quote. They would, quote, suffer the same fate as the priest who visited an unbelieving insurance agent on his deathbed, hoping to convert him, but in the end went home with an insurance policy, end quote. The pamphlet is well produced. There is a good introduction, marred only by the fatuous statement that, quote, through the 1920s, Leninism in the hands of Stalin was rapidly becoming transformed into the ideological litany of the new managerial class that was being established throughout Russia, end quote. Alas, Leninism was not, quote, becoming, end quote, anything. It had been just that for many a year, certainly since October, and probably from much earlier. Whether we discuss Lenin's views on sex, see the irrational in politics, on his views on the virtues of, quote, one-man management, end quote, see the Bolsheviks and workers' control, the clues are there for those who can read them. Published in Solidarity, Volume 7, Issue 3, 1972.